Welcome back to Unit 3. What size of firm should you be looking at? Size does matter in this case, funny enough. Sometimes smaller is actually better. But when you're buying one of these firms, you want to look at how is this going to integrate in with the practice that you've already got. Do they use the same software as you use? Do they have staff that's coming along? How much money do you have to actually pay for one of these things? These things, if they're smaller, can be bought for very little money down. And keep in mind, too, if you're not dealing with a broker, you're going to have an easier time getting in for less money down. Dealing with somebody selling their business is far easier than dealing with the broker. I hate to say the brokers get in the way, but they kind of get in the way. They can also be an avenue to get to some of the larger firms. It's tougher to get to a larger firm for sale without dealing with a broker. Typically, a more established firm, they're going to go to a broker first. But, let's kind of go through these things, what you're looking at in terms of, let's start with a list. A list would be anything that the brokers would consider. I once had a broker tell me that a list is essentially a list of clients that's not quite a practice. That somebody, if they had that list, they would have a hard time making a living using that as their only source of business. So sometimes what you actually get, and we've bought lists before from clients after they passed away, there's, this is all that's left. The widow comes and says, hey, I've lost a big chunk of this work, but this is what's left. Would you pay me for it? Typically in that situation, you're going to be able to get that list for just the amount that you collect on a percentage. So you might go back to the people and say, okay, look, I don't know what I'm getting. I don't know how much the clients are going to make their way over to us. How many have left? How many even understand that, who we are, what's going on. And so you want the family to write a letter, or you want the accountant, if he's sick and he's just turning over some things left, to contact those clients that are on that list and let them know that they're recommending you and they're coming over to you. In that case, you're usually going to pay a percentage of the collections, really only, maybe a very small down payment, 10%, something like that. This is about, like maybe a $50,000 list or maybe up to $150,000, where it's not, like I said, a complete practice. Those tend to sell for about one times billings, maybe a little less than one times billings, because it's going to be based on the collections. But you're going to base that on taking on a percentage. I like to do 3 years in that situation because after 5 years, you're just kind of tired of paying the people back. It's kind of, a fatigue, even though you may be paying a smaller percentage, maybe a 15 or 20% over 5 years versus a 25 or 30% over 3 years, depending on that. But, that's typically, what we're talking about. So the smaller size firms, this would be, something from maybe 150,000 to 400,000. Those can also be bought with little or no money down. A lot of times, if they're closer to the $400,000 or $500,000 range, that's where you're maybe dealing with a broker. That broker is going to want to, basically strong arm you into putting all of the money down. Hey, you need to come up with 100% down or 85% down so that guy can sell his practice and move on with his life. Typically, you're dealing with a sole practitioner at that point. They might have one, maybe two staff members that come along with you to keep moving on. And sometimes those staff members aren't the highest quality. They're used to doing things the way, Steve or Mary did it, whoever you bought this firm from. So, it's not always, it's kind of a mixed bag, kind of a hit or miss. So you want to make sure that you do your due diligence with the staff and with the clients. And, you want to fight that broker, if you're dealing with a broker, to put down the least amount of cash outlay as possible. When you get into this, you can always, if it's going great and money's coming in and you're collecting it faster, you can always work something out with the seller later to pay them back faster if you want to. Or just, what I would recommend is put the money aside and use that money, the extra money that you're collecting to, pay them, just to pay from that pool of money that you've collected. An established firm, that's going to sell for 1 to 1.25 times billings. The brokers are going to push the rate up on that. They'll sometimes go up to 1.5 to 1.75 times on that. Be careful. We were dealing once with a firm in Nevada and negotiating with the broker, negotiating with the seller. The last full year's billings were in the low 400s. The seller said he estimated the current billings to date, this was mid-year. The following year was about 460. This was just his estimate. And he said by the end of the year, he'd be at 490. Well, that's a huge jump from, 410, let's say, to 490 all in 1 year. And he wanted us to pay him out over that 490 number at 1.33 or more times billings. So we immediately, negotiated that down. And that was actually a deal we eventually, at the very last minute, walked away from just because the seller had an unrealistic view of how much money we were willing to put up front and how much money, an unrealistic view of how much money should be put up front. That's funny because this one's just happened recently. As of last week, we checked just out of curiosity. We looked on the broker's list and it's still for sale. So I'm not completely surprised that that's, 4 months later still on the market. I think that seller, may be unrealistic about it. We're actually dealing with another one locally here right now, almost identical in size, and we're coming up with about 20% down. So much more reasonable, 3-year payout. That's what you're looking at, at a $400,000 to $500,000 practice. And in this case, the seller wants to get out and move on. He has another job that he's taking someplace else. And so in that case, we're getting this at 1.1. So depending on the situation of the seller, depending on how much time they're going to help you or how much time they're going to spend helping you transition them over, that has a huge impact on what size you should buy and also what you should pay for these things. So obviously, the larger the firm, the more you're going to have to pay. However, circumstances dictate, looking these things over and actually determining whether you could actually get it at a cheaper price. Well, obviously, the more that you do on these, the more comfortable you're going to feel rolling that practice into yours. We understand here that, there are certain software programs that will integrate easier with our firm that other ones won't. And honestly, in some cases, that keeps us from even bidding on a certain size practice because, hey, for me to take a client with a different software program that for taxes, for example, to try and get that converted over and get it into what we use on top of all the other stuff that we're doing may not be worth the extra effort. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. So the size of the firm, who's working at the firm, these all have a lot to factor in. So especially if they're bringing staff in. So you want to make sure that that's actually a good thing. It can be a great thing, especially nowadays with the difficulty finding staff. That can always be a rub is that, hey, this person's coming in with a couple of staff, but they're not any good. They're difficult. They don't want to, bend their way of doing things to the way you do things. And again, as we talked about, I think in the previous unit, you want to try and buy firms that are as much like yours as possible. That integration process is going to be a lot easier that way. Obviously, there's never going to be 100% fit, but it's easier to roll them into yours when they're doing things like you do because the clients will understand better. You'll be able to pull them in with less arguing from the clients, with less hassle because they'll be used to doing things the way you do things because the way you're doing it is similar to the seller. One of the last things to talk about in Unit 3 here now is office space. Do you take on their office space or not? Obviously, in today's day and age, when office space is becoming less and less important, and we're trying to go as much virtual and lower our costs for these kinds of things as much as possible, I would say office space only if you absolutely need it. Like I think I've mentioned, several times already in the first couple of units, is we purchased a firm literally downstairs in the same building as us. Obviously, I'm not going to take their office space on. I had no intention of getting that office. I didn't want that office. I brought the whole practice up here and we integrated it into our office. That was files, clients, staff, the whole thing. Did I want his office furniture? Absolutely not. We had our own office furniture. There was a desk or two that I might have taken from him. I think I took a fax machine. This was a long time ago when we used fax machines, and a handful of printers. And the only computer that he was using for his storage of data, I brought that one up here as well. And I paid him nothing for any of it because honestly, none of this stuff is usually worth anything. So don't let the seller con you into paying for their furniture or anything. They're going to have to pay people to take it away. Nobody wants their furniture. And the only reason you would want to move into their office is if you were possibly moving out of your office and moving into their office makes sense. So I would try and keep us down to one office if you can, or, if you're actually, obviously, if you're opening up offices in other cities and you're expanding in a much larger way, then that might be a different deal. But just spoke with a guy in Minnesota who has purchased a couple of firms, put them together. One was a bookkeeping firm, one was a tax firm. He's all virtual. And the staffs don't know each other at all, don't even really need to know each other at this point. But, he's just now in the early stages of it, and we're helping him out and talking him through and walking him through that process of integrating in those two firms and really more seeing what the upside of having those two firms work with each other, taking business and now integrating new business from, say, the bookkeeping firm that didn't do any taxes Well, now the tax firm can start picking up the corporate tax work from the bookkeeping firm and maybe even some individual tax work. So that's, a really nice upside for that purchase because they're getting a lot more from both because they can actually now provide services that both didn't offer in the past. So, just things like that. That's why you want to look at reducing your costs because you're going to have duplication of costs, but you also want to look at adding income opportunities when you're adding new firms to yours, or in this case, taking two completely different firms and having them feed off each other in a positive way. So that's I think it for Unit 3. Let's get ready for Unit 4. See you there.